Alright boys, I want to start this by saying that I don't have any military training whatsoever, and for all intents and purposes my opinion is worth very little, but I'm going to give my opinion anyway. We've seen a lot of headlines about how tanks are going to become obsolete, mainly from the results of the recent fighting in a certain part of the world. We've seen large amounts of anti-tank guided missiles and single-use anti-tank weapons being shipped into that conflict zone and used against the aggressor. The result, seemingly if we believe all the Western media, is that these anti-tank weapons are destroying the aggressor's tank force. However, in reality, it's largely debatable. We're seeing a lot of tanks that have been abandoned due to low morale as well as getting stuck in the mud, as well as a lot of tanks being knocked out by traditional heavy artillery. Now, if you've been on Twitter recently, you'll probably believe that all warfare is now based on anti-tank guided missiles such as the Javelin and NLAW, as well as drones. Weapons that are by no means new, but are seemingly taking the spotlight all of a sudden. But I'd argue, again from a completely uneducated position, that we aren't really learning anything new in this conflict. So why are so many people saying that the tank is obsolete? Well, that's a fantastic question, and I don't really know myself. It's fair to say, however, that the Ukrainian publicity has been very good. Their PR and PSYOPs team are doing a terrific job, but I think it's very important, especially for Western planners, not to fall for your own propaganda. Now, I enjoy seeing the illegal invading armies being knocked back as much as anyone else, but we shouldn't get complacent or overconfident about certain Eastern military powers, as if we do, it'll be our own armed forces that suffer. And there's certainly no question that anti-tank missiles and weaponry are good at destroying tanks, but the clue's in the name, they're designed to destroy tanks. So what's currently going on, and why are these tanks seemingly so bad at doing what they're supposed to be doing, which is rolling through Ukraine and capturing key objectives? Well, let's start, if I may, with a little bit of history. The main lessons learned for the Western allies in World War II was the strength of land and carrier-based aircraft. However, on the Eastern Front, this was different. Although the Russian Air Force was quite large, it was by no means as effective at achieving the Russian victory as ground-based heavy artillery, such as howitzers and multiple launch rocket systems. The two different lessons learned by the East and West went on to shape their respective armed forces, with the Russians largely being a fire and manoeuvre-based military, and Western militaries mainly being a Air Force-focused military. This is demonstrated quite well by the fact that Western militaries use the Air Force as a largely offensive type weapon, whereas the main purpose of the Russian Air Force has always been to defend the motherland. This is basically a long way of saying that Russian howitzers and mass columns of tanks have always been the main way that a Russian army would advance. So, what's happened in Ukraine? Well, as you'd expect in any conflict, there was an opening salvo of long-range cruise missiles and other standoff weapons. This was designed to knock out key installations of the Ukrainian armed forces, such as command and control centres, air defence systems, major air bases, and other key military installations. After this though, the Russian Air Force was largely missing. Now, this was quite shocking for Western observers. Western doctrine would mean that mass swarms of air power would take off, initially with anti-radiation and air-to-ground missile systems, further suppressing and destroying the remaining air defence networks that were still present. That is what Western and NATO militaries would have done. But we didn't see that. We saw a mass advance of Russian tanks and other infantry fighting vehicles. This rather embarrassingly led to the first few days of civilians in cars driving up to them throwing Molotov cocktails into troop transports and other places you really don't want flammable objects to be. It didn't take long though until we started to see the remains of several tanks had been blown up. And in the recent days, as I'm recording this, just at the beginning of April, we've had confirmation that over 250 Russian tanks have been confirmed to be lost. Again, not all from direct Ukrainian fire, but a good chunk of them to say the least. Now, I have personally seen a lot of videos of tanks being knocked out. There's a few clips of the tanks in Mariupol, where it's just two T-72s driving down a street which gets hit by multiple rockets. And at face value you could say, well, it's a cheap disposable anti-tank weapon system that knocked out a tank. Tanks are obsolete, right? But it was a tank in an urban environment driving without any infantry support whatsoever. Every tanker in the Western country would have cringed watching those videos. There was also another video where I can't remember where it was from, but it was a tank column moving down a street, and the lead tank got hit by an NLAW, killing the driver, and eventually burst into flames and cooked off. Again, like that previous clip, it was a relatively cheap anti-tank system knocking out a rather expensive tank. But that clip is similar to quite a lot of other clips I've seen, and it involves Russian troops using tanks as the spearhead of their advance. Granted, there have been lots of T-72s and other types of main battle tank accompanied by BMPs and other types of infantry fighting vehicle, but there's no real boots on the ground scanning ahead. And this is where my surprise comes from. It's not really any shock to me, so it certainly isn't a shock to a trained military advisor, that driving heavy armoured columns, which are famous for being very loud and kicking up an awful lot of dust through contested or hostile territory, is going to get you ambushed. As I've been saying, this isn't shocking or new to anyone that has a millicum of knowledge of basic military principles. So I've been dunking on Russian equipment now for a few minutes. Again, I'd largely say that's down to poor general planning, but how would NATO do things a little bit differently? Well, the same initial opening would be the same in my opinion. You'd have long-range standoff weaponry like cruise missiles that would knock out command and control, basically the exact same what the Russians did. NATO would then use its air power to suppress enemy air defence and destroy enemy air defence seed and deed respectively. After the long-range air defence systems have been knocked out, you'd then have anti-radiation missiles flying around trying to find the shorter range air defence systems such as the TORs and the Buk. After these have been dealt with, which may take quite a while, but eventually they would get knocked out. That would then give Western infantry pretty much unlimited close air support, and NATO troops would start to advance. Initially, it would be the very light troops going forward first, basically recon units. Again though, this isn't new to military. The Romans were doing this 2,500 years ago, where the Roman conscripts, the velites, would go forward and probe the enemy. And that's exactly what Western troops would do, although I doubt they'd be armed with throwing spears. Anyway, Western reconnaissance troops would make contact with the enemy, they would then report their position. These enemy troops, who would likely be armed with anti-tank guided missiles such as Javelin and NLAW, or the Russian or Chinese equivalent, would then be targeted by Western air power and heavy artillery. After these enemy troops had been suppressed or destroyed by howitzers and air power, you would then have the larger, heavier units of NATO power being rolled in. This is where the tanks come in. This is one of the major differences between Western and Eastern military doctrine at the minute. The Russians are using their tanks as the main spearhead, whereas in Western countries, tanks are mainly support for infantry. It is the air power of Western nations that do all the heavy lifting, so to speak. We often think of tank engagements where we have advanced tanks with modern thermal sights which hunt down and engage enemy armour. A modern tank-on-tank engagement could take place, but against a Western or NATO opponent, it's quite unlikely. There's a reason so much money has been spent on Western air forces, mainly in the development of joint strike fighters, as well as forward-looking infrared targeting pods. While it is cool to think of a modern Kursk battlefield where mass swarms of tanks would engage each other, Western militaries just aren't built around that. It is our aircraft that will be the main anti-tank weaponry system. Things like Apache helicopters with the Hellfire missiles, the Maverick air-to-ground missile from several planes such as the A-10, even though it is a little bit of a meme now, as well as the good old-fashioned JDAM. All of these weapons are very effective at destroying tanks, and have been since the early 80s. Now, if the Russian Air Force was capable of destroying the Western Air Forces, which they currently aren't, Western tanks would be obsolete, because the Russian Air Force would be able to target them. But as I said, there is a reason that Western Air Forces have had so much money pumped into them. If you control the sky, you control the engagement. Again, this isn't new at all, the Americans have known this since Vietnam. The question shouldn't really be, are tanks obsolete? It should be, is it worth fighting a war if you can't guarantee air supremacy? I'd say the answer to that question is no, as unfortunately many thousands of Russian soldiers are finding out. So I think I've made it quite clear that Western tanks aren't really designed for engaging enemy tanks. They kind of are, don't start typing in the comment section for that. The guns on modern tanks are still capable of knocking out enemy tanks, at least at fairly close range, below 2 kilometers say. But they're mainly there to support the infantry. Most tanks carry predominantly high explosive rounds and then a few armor piercing rounds, if they do meet enemy tanks. It's not like a video game where you're going into an engagement with pretty much all APF-SGS rounds. The main loadout for tanks is high explosive, for engaging fixed positions and infantry. Now that fire support role, supporting the infantry, is pretty much a constant thing that is never going to go away. you are always going to have a fire advantage against an enemy that doesn't have tanks, even if they do have anti-tank guided missiles. As I've said, your lightly armoured troops should engage them first, allowing them to be suppressed by your artillery, and hopefully air power. In theory, this should destroy most of the anti-tank capabilities by knocking out quite a large amount of personnel. That would then allow for friendly tanks to come into the engagement and to support the infantry. Now you could say, well, they might have some javelins left or NLAWs left. And that's true, but modern Western and Chinese and Soviet main Russian main battle tanks, they are all predominantly armoured to deal with chemical warheads. They mainly have layered composite armour, which from the frontal 60-degree cone makes them pretty much immune from all shaped charge and chemical warheads. Now things like the NLAW and the Javelin have tried to counter this. These are top attack munitions, which means they fly above a target and then detonate against the weaker turret roof armour or hull roof armour. And as we've seen from the several videos, these weapon systems are very effective at destroying tanks. But tank evolution hasn't stopped. The Israeli army, probably the army with the most experience of dealing with chemical munitions, has pretty famously developed the Trophy Active Protection System, which is very effective against countering most rocket-propelled grenades such as the RPG and other anti-tank guided missile systems. While these systems aren't widely fielded on most Western tanks, it's highly likely in the coming years, as the technology gets cheaper and more well developed, you will start to see these more and more on most main battle tank series. This, in theory, should protect tanks from these sorts of anti-tank guided missiles. Which again, I'm quite puzzled as to why we're seeing so much noise from social media about how tanks are nearing the end of their useful life. As active protection systems, in combination with the layered composite armour, does give quite a reasonable survivability to most main battle tanks. You could also say that purely from an economic point of view, that a cheap single-use anti-tank guided missile or anti-tank rocket system, you can knock out a very expensive tank with a single missile really. And that's all well and good until you consider Western country military doctrine. It's very easy to develop a military strategy which is based on your enemy not reacting to what you're doing. For an example, if a Western military went to war and it was found out that a certain weapon system was destroying large amounts of Western tanks, we'd use our intelligence agencies to find out where are these weapons being produced, where are they stored, can we counter them? We could then use our air power to either destroy where they are being held, where they are being manufactured, or where the troop concentrations are which are firing them. As I said, this is a little bit of a ramble, but the idea of a tank is never going to go away. It is just something that supports the infantry. You could say that the idea of a tank being the main spearhead of an army is obsolete, and you'd be absolutely true, but that's something that Western countries have known since Vietnam. Air power is the king. As long as you can guarantee air superiority, then there will always be a place for the tank. And if we're going to be perfectly honest with ourselves, if the Soviet Union and later Russians didn't have nuclear weapons, their armed forces would largely be very unimpressive. We could slowly destroy their armoured columns and air defence systems without really having to mobilise troops very far forward. As I said earlier, the question shouldn't be, are tanks obsolete? Tanks are no longer the main battlefield weapon, but again, this isn't new. We could criticise pretty much every other type of military equipment like this. For example, in Ukraine we've seen loads of helicopters shot down, we've seen loads of infantry fighting vehicles, BTRs, BMP-2s destroyed. No one's saying we should scrap the Bradleys, or scrap other sorts of infantry fighting vehicles, or God forbid scrap helicopters. Because if you don't control the sky, then everything else is largely irrelevant. If you're going against a military power, like a Western NATO power which is based on air power, if you don't control the skies, then every single piece of equipment in your arsenal is rather obsolete by that standard. Because Western air power can strike where it's either being held, where it's being used on the battlefield, or where it's manufactured. Now there is quite a lot to say about what tanks are going to evolve into. We've seen the Americans focus largely on making a very light tank with similar firepower. That's more of a logistical issue though. It's quite hard to transport main battle tanks around the world at the minute. There's only a few countries that have heavy lift capable aircraft. So while there have been quite a lot of very lightly armoured tank concepts going around, the heavier main battle tank is still the way forward so far. Again, I'm not a planner, but we're still using these tanks, so they must still be useful. It's the same scenario with the drones. Everyone's saying these drones are, oh, it's going to revolutionise warfare. No, it's not. Drones give you local air superiority. We know for a fact that the Americans have anti-drone electronic warfare systems. It's fair to say Ukraine it doesn't have a highly advanced military, at least electronically. And even in the areas where drones have been used to very good effect, mainly in Azerbaijan and Armenia, it was still the ground-based maneuver units, such as the tanks, the Azerbaijani tanks, which were the main reason the Armenians had to leave their positions. And those Azerbaijani tanks weren't engaging enemy Armenian tanks, they were firing high explosive at Armenian infantry positions, supporting the infantry. The primary tank purpose, the primary reason of having tanks in the first place, always has been infantry support. And that role, that battlefield role, will just never go away. It will always be there. Anyway, I don't really know how long this video is going to be because I'm just rambling here. It's kind of I'm a little bit triggered by several tweets and articles I've seen. But anyway, feel free to comment below how much of a moron I am that I don't know what I'm talking about, because I really don't. This is just observations from not even armchair general, an armchair conscript, shall we say. That's how much I know. I don't have any official military training or anything like that, but I am a bit of a artist on the internet, so I guess that makes me qualified to be an actual military commander, I guess. Anyway, I'm rambling again. I'm rambling on my rambling. Hopefully this wasn't too autistic and actually was somewhat informative, but who knows.